Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. We're continuing a conversation with Jacob Vidrine of the Church of the Firstborn. In our next conversation, we're going to dive into LeBaron Succession, Margarito Bautista. Some of you may have heard of him. He was part of the Third Convention in Mexico, and how that relates to the different LeBaron groups. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out.
So is this also in the 1950s when... So it sounds
1940s, I'd say.
Oh, in the 40s?
Yeah.
So the LeBarons are kind of having a, I don't know, succession crisis, right?
Yeah, it's that same thing about the same time.
But the Wooleyite group is having it with John Y. Barlow and Rulon Allred and stuff like that.
Yep. And so with so Dare only taught the first two sons. He was very hesitant about teaching the rest of his children about his authority claims. But so the problem, Ross, and he thinks he's going to get the birthright of his family, but he kind of has a rocky relationship with his dad as a teenager, and he gets he rebels against his father, leaves home at age of 16 because he said he felt his father was too authoritarian for him, requiring him to do chores, different things. And so there's a rocky relationship there. And so Ross said that he initially goes and interacts with the Wooley fundamentalists in Utah, and that his grandfather, Benjamin Franklin LeBaron, kind of warns him, that some of their priesthood doctrines aren't quite right, so be cautious. Some of their doctrines aren't correct. But Ross said that he initially did kind of eat up, their claims initially, and he was kind of having a mesh of what his father had taught him, and then also kind of incorporating the Wooley beliefs. And he said it wasn't until the 1940s he had a revelatory experience or vision that really confirmed to him that his father's real authority claim was everything that his father claimed it was. And so he said after having this experience that he attempts to live plural marriage. He actually ends up going to prison for trying to live plural marriage during the 1940s. He was just on conspiracy to attempt to live it, basically. But he gets out of prison, and when his father is visiting him in 1950, he says that his father gives him a blessing, a patriarchal blessing, and confers upon him all the keys, rights, and authority of the patriarchal order of priesthood. And that is the basis of Ross's authority claim. And he says that he understood this was the keys restored in the Kirtland Temple by Moses, Elias, and Elijah. So that those temple keys, if that makes sense. And then his father, he wasn't appointing him as successor yet, but what Ross said is that his father told him, "You need to go get your family in order," kind of thing. I'm setting you, giving you authority as a patriarch, and now you need to go get your family in order. And then the next time he's visiting with Dare, he's kind of telling him, your health is failing. You really need to appoint a successor before you die. And what Ross and a lot
Dare's health is failing.
Yeah, Dare is getting old. His health is failing. And what multiple people recall Dare said is, "I can't appoint a successor until the Holy Ghost tells me who to appoint," is kind of what multiple sources say. And so Ross said that he got a revelation then, that his dad, a revelation from God saying, "Your father will not confer upon you the birthright, but he's already given you the keys. If you ask him for a commission to carry on the patriarchal work in his stead, and he will give it to you." And so Ross says that he asked his father for a commission, and that his father said, "You are free to carry on the patriarchal work as the Lord inspires you." And so that's kind of the basis of Ross's claim. What happens is Dare goes down to Mexico, and his health rapidly starts failing by the end of the year, 1950, 1951, exact same time Musser.
Oh, I was going to say.
Yeah, right?
Because I think Musser died in 53.
Yeah, 53 or 54, I think.
Yeah.
And so Dare's health is failing him, and he's basically, has some say it was he had a stroke, some say he had nerve disease. I'm not sure which it was, but essentially he was bedridden, and he got to the point he couldn't even feed himself or even move his arms. He had to be, basically taken care of completely by other.
I like the community of Christ's ability to retire.
Yeah. You've had a good conversation with David Nilsson about, the idea of, what happens to men in their old age sort of thing.
Right.
And so with Dayer, he's wanting to appoint the birthright on his deathbed. And basically, some of the sources say that he, the different sons are coming to him and trying to kind of vie for it. And that Ben, the oldest, who's, mentally ill, is trying to get him to confirm him. And another son, Alma Jr., is trying to fight for it. And that Joel, one of the younger sons, comes to visit the father. And that according to what Maud wrote shortly after Dayer's death, is that she said that Dayer really wanted to give Joel the birthright, but he said he couldn't unless the Holy Ghost directed him to. And he basically told Joel that the birthright is yours if I don't give it to one of the other boys. It's kind of
That's not very helpful.
it's kind of a vague authority. That's the earliest source. In this letter that Maud wrote, right, less than a couple of days after Dayer died, it's really important for understanding the contemporary, what was going on in the weeks before his death. It's mentioning that, that's kind of the earliest accounts of Joel's claim, basically. And it's not as solid as, the family would later tell it. It's very like, if it doesn't go to someone else, and it said that he wanted to give it to him but couldn't unless the Holy Ghost directed him, kind of thing. And in that letter, it says that he sent for Ross or Wesley. Ross was called Wesley by all of his close friends and family.
Oh, I didn't know that.
By his middle name, kind of like Dayer being called by his middle name. And so they said he sent for Wesley to come to Mexico and qualify. And so Ross basically said that his father wrote for him to come down to Mexico on his deathbed, but that he was under bond he was on parole for attempting to live polygamy, and he was incarcerated for that. And so he said he was under bond not to leave the state of Utah. And so he said he couldn't go down to Mexico because of that. But he said that his father already had given him all the keys that he held. And so he felt that, he didn't necessarily need to go down to Mexico, if that was kind of his mentality. He felt that somebody else had put up the bail money for him to be released on bail. And he said that, he felt it was an honorable thing to do to not skip the state and cost the other person the money that they had put out, kind of thing. And so what happened, so Dayer dies, and in the after...
So he hasn't named a successor.
Without having an appointed successor on his death, that is what I've gathered from the historical sources, except for, there's the potential, like there's statements. Well, what Maud tries to say is that...
Well, it's just like Joseph Smith.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is Maud does try in that letter say that Ben was appointed the successor. She says that we coaxed him and finally he gave Ben a fine blessing, is what she said in that letter. And what is in Lyle Wright's thesis, interviewing somebody else who was living on the property, is that they really wore him out, and they felt like they can, he couldn't speak at that point. His paralysis even had gone to his throat, and so he could barely even communicate, basically. And so what this other letter says is that that there was this, there was almost a torturing him into giving a blessing, basically, like, tormenting the old dying man kind of thing. And what Esther wrote about the 1951 letter is she was like, I was really distressed about this, 1951 letter, right after Dayer died. And she said, I was distressed learning thinking that Ben would have gotten it, because Ben wasn't mentally well. Like, he couldn't, if he did get something, it couldn't be anything important, basically. And so she left the matter at that. But what other family sources say is that the blessing that Ben had coaxed him into giving was actually before trying to appoint Joel. And that Maud actually said, how the hell can you give it to Joel? I thought Ben already had it, is kind of what some of the later family sources said about attempt to give it to Joel. And so Ben, is sketchy. Joel is sketchy. With Ross, he's basically saying, I was given the authority, but I wasn't formally appointed the successor. And I would say that's very similar to Brigham Young's authority claim, in that he was given the full authority by Joseph Smith, and he was true to Joseph's teachings, but he admitted that he was not the proper, legal successor is the term, that it should be one of Joseph's sons when they came of age. If they came to Utah and accepted plural marriage and all of their father's teachings, right? Mm-hmm. It's not Lyman White almost made it sound like an unconditional thing, that it had to be Joseph's posterity to preside. It couldn't be anyone else. Brigham Young had a qualified view of it, where it could only be an heir if the heir qualifies to, preside. And Brigham said, if David comes out here, we would welcome. Well, we would welcome him. And David would write kind of poems, kind of rebuttaling them, saying, "No, I'm the youngest son, and you've got two older sons to look to, rather than me," kind of thing. David was I heard he was an incredible poet, and I thought that poem at least was pretty funny. If you've read From Mission to Madness, mm-hmm.
The
biography on him, there's also an interesting parallel there where David went mentally crazy, right? Later in life, and he was institutionalized for the rest of his life. What some of the sources try to say is that he came out to Utah, became convinced that his father did actually live polygamy, and was just mentally destroyed, believing that his mother had lied to him all this time. And so they believe that at least was a contributing factor to his mental illness. Mm-hmm. And so you kind of have a parallel there where Joseph's first, born in the new and everlasting covenant.
Lastborn, but yeah.
Lastborn, but first, the one who was the intended heir goes crazy. And similarly with Dare, his intended oldest son also went crazy. And so, there was this question, this was, would arguably lead to a succession crisis, right? If you don't have a very clear successor laid out when the previous claimant dies, right? And so what happens after Dare's death is that Maud, and part of the reason I believe that Dare was kind of hesitant about appointing Joel, like he said, I can't do it unless the Holy Ghost lets me, is that Joel and the other sons were leaning towards wanting to be part of the Woolley group, some of those younger sons. And had actually been part of the Woolley group. And you see that in some of the meetings that some of those sons were involved with the Woolley group. And so they didn't really accept their father's priesthood authority, if that makes sense. And so how could you give the presiding authority to someone who doesn't quite believe in it, I guess, is kind of the question there. And so what happened after Dare died is that those sons down in Mexico actually invited Bautista to come over and to organize them into a branch of the Woolley group, which really was kind of the what would be the AUB side of the split at that time.
Okay.
And, they have records of the meetings where like Joel LeBaron and Ervil LeBaron and Alma Jr., these guys are sustaining Bautista as holding keys, and that they accept, that Rulon Allred, and after Musser dies, and then they accept that these guys have the priesthood authority. And so,
was Margarito Bautista in Rulon Allred's group, or vice versa? Like, were they affiliated?
Yes, I would say.
Oh,
yeah, they were definitely. Bautista was more independent. He kind of had an independent streak about him, where he was more into his Mexican nationalism, where he was really big on, we shouldn't have a bunch of whites from Utah be leading our churches here in Mexico.
Yeah, I remember that, yeah.
And so he had his own kind of authority justification based off of being a Lamanite. He felt that he felt there were special promises from the Book of Mormon about the Lamanites taking precedence over the Gentiles. And so but he was ordained by Musser, and there was an affiliation between the Bautista group and the AUB, and there might still be.
Was he part of the Council of Friends?
So I feel like Musser was possibly wanting to call him to a council, but he ended up not. We ordained him an apostle. He ordained him an apostle. I don't think when Musser did his new council in 1952, Bautista wasn't on the new council. He was kind of just the guy over Mexico, an apostle over Mexico, I think is kind of what happened there. And so
probably because they kind of split.
Well, I don't even know how split it necessarily is per se, because that's where the AUB ended up building their temple, right, in the 1980s, was down in Mexico.
Yeah, but didn't Margarito Bautista's group eventually join back in the LDS Church? So there had to be kind of a split with Rule and Allred.
Not the fundamentalist part. So Bautista was involved with the Third Convention,
right?
The Mexican nationalist split off of the LDS Church, and he was involved with that movement. But then that movement did eventually reconcile back to the LDS Church. But Bautista became more of a fundamentalist and was involved with more of a Mexican fundamentalist church movement.
Okay.
Is what,
because they just did a video on that new temple. Well, I think it's new.
What I thought was cool about that video about the AUB's temple in Mexico is, they talked about it was just recently rededicated.
Okay.
I think it's interesting they rededicated it like right after the independent temple in Missouri was dedicated, right?
Yeah.
I thought there's something interesting. I don't know if it's just a coincidence or not.
That was a very popular video of mine, the independence one.
Yeah, like it's a very rare thing for a fundamentalist to build a temple, right?
Yeah.
And so with Bautista, so that was in the 1980s, right? That what was good about that video is it showed that the rededication date and also the original dedication date for the AUB's temple. I think they said it's been 40 years of having a temple, right?
Right.
And so 1984, which that's pretty quick that they started doing temple ordinances, I believe, 82, and then they got a temple built by 84, if I'm getting that history correct. But so the Mexico LeBarons were part of the AUB throughout the early 1950s, from 1951.
That's how Rule and Allred kind of ties everything together.
Yeah, so in 1951 all the way up to 1955. And so what happens in 1955 and why they eventually split off from the AUB is...
Why? Who split off from the AUB?
The Mexico LeBarons.
Okay.
So in 1955, they go up to Utah to request funding from the AUB council there to start a United Order in Mexico. And when they're up there, so there's multiple sources about them going to the AUB council and, sustaining their leadership. And
now you say the Mexico LeBarons. I just want to make sure we're clear. Have we split with Ross and Ervil and who was the other one?
Joel. So Joel and Ervil are down in Mexico. Ross is in Utah.
Okay.
And as soon as Dare dies, Ross begins basically proclaiming himself as the successor and saying that he had to revelate. He had the voice of the Spirit tell him that the patriarchal work of the house of the patriarchal work was now on his shoulders, basically, that he was now the one to carry on the work. And
so Ross is in Utah, Ervil and Joel are in Mexico.
Yep.
They come to Utah to the AUB because kind of the headquarters are in like Buckdale.
Yep.
Okay.
And what I would say with Ross, part of why he made his claim the way he did, with that revelation, he said that to ask your dad to appoint you to carry on the work, but not ask for the birthright. What that revelation said is the honor is in the work, not the title. And so in fundamentalism, there's a whole lot of claiming titles. And I think that's a much more powerful idea about it being more important to do the work than to claim the title. So.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Jacob Vidrine of the Church of the Firstborn. We're not done with Jacob yet. You can see we kind of had an abrupt ending there. But we're going to move on and continue our conversation a week later. And we're going to talk a little bit more. So here's a sneak peek.
the 1840s, especially on the Trek West, there was a teaching that was known as the law of adoption, where different families and men would be sealed to men, this linking of men in the priesthood to each other, father-son relationships, and even families being linked.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.